I worked at Callaway Distribution for 8 years. 8 years of early mornings, late nights, and weekends I gave up without being asked twice. I knew every client by name, every account by history, every quirk of every contract we'd ever signed. My manager, Bob. That's what I'll call him because some habits die hard. He used to say I was the backbone of the Western region. Said it in front of the whole department at the Christmas party 2 years ago. Handed me a gift card and a handshake and told everyone I was the reason we hit 118% of quota. I still have the photo from that night on my phone. I'm telling you this not to brag. I'm telling you this because you need to understand what it felt like 6 months later when Bob called me into his office and told me the senior account director position, the one I'd been working toward for 3 years, the one we'd informally talked about like it was already mine, was going to someone else. His nephew. Connor had been with the company for 11 weeks. I remember sitting across from Bob's desk and just staring at the motivational poster behind his head. Great things take time. I counted the letters while he talked. I don't remember half of what he said. Something about fresh perspective. Something about exciting new direction. I nodded. I said, "I understand." I stood up, shook his hand, and walked back to my desk. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't say any of the things that were piling up behind my teeth. I pulled up a blank document and I started typing my resignation letter. Let me back up, because this story didn't start in that office. It started 8 years ago when I was 34 years old and a regional sales company in Denver was looking for someone to manage their Western accounts. I'd spent 6 years before that at a smaller firm learning the industry from the ground up. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't the guy who worked the room at industry conferences. I was the guy who returned every email the same day, who read every contract twice, who kept a notebook of every client preference, every birthday, every time someone mentioned their kid was playing soccer or their wife was recovering from surgery. That notebook had 340 pages by the time I left. My first year at Callaway, I inherited a book of business that was honestly a mess. 3 of our top accounts were on the verge of leaving. The previous manager had overpromised on delivery timelines and underdelivered on follow-through. I spent my first 4 months doing nothing but damage control. Called clients I'd never met, flew out to meet 2 of them in person on my own dime, worked out revised terms that were fair to everyone. By the end of year 1, all 3 accounts renewed. 1 of them expanded. Bob noticed. He started including me in leadership meetings, started asking for my input on territory strategy. He'd stop by my desk on Friday afternoons just to talk through problems. I thought we had a real working relationship. Looking back, I think I was useful to him, which is not the same thing. The years went on. I mentored 2 junior reps who both got promoted ahead of me. I was happy for them, genuinely, because I'd helped get them there. I took on the Pacific Northwest expansion project when nobody else wanted it. I traveled to Portland and Seattle and Boise and Vancouver for 18 months straight, building relationships with clients who'd never heard of Callaway. By the time that project closed out, we'd added 12 new accounts and I'd put close to 100,000 miles on my frequent flyer card. My salary was $68,000 a year. I wasn't bitter about the money. I know that sounds like something a bitter person says, but I mean it. I cared about the work. I cared about doing it well. I cared about the clients who trusted me and the colleagues who leaned on me and the reputation I'd built, which was the kind of reputation that takes years and can't be faked. I figured the rest would follow eventually. That's where I was wrong. The senior account director position opened up in February. It wasn't a surprise. Donna, the outgoing director, had been telegraphing her retirement for a year. The job came with a $15,000 salary increase, a seat at the leadership table, and oversight of the entire Western Territory I'd spent 8 years building. Bob told me personally, in so many words, to start thinking about what my vision for the role would look like. He said we'd talk more after the first quarter closed. I spent March and April preparing. I put together a 40-page business plan. I outlined a 3-year growth strategy with specific account targets, a mentorship structure for junior reps, and a proposal for expanding into 2 new market segments. I didn't have to do that. Nobody asked me to. I did it because I was serious, and I wanted Bob to know I was serious. We never had that meeting. Connor arrived in the middle of April. He was introduced at the all-hands as Bob's nephew, 27 years old, fresh out of a 2-year MBA program. No industry experience, no sales background. He'd done a summer internship at a tech startup and a 6-month stint at a marketing agency. Bob introduced him warmly, mentioned the family connection like it was a fun fact rather than a red flag, and said Connor was going to be learning the ropes in the Western region. I shook his hand. He had a good handshake, I'll give him that. Firm, confident. The handshake of someone who'd been taught to make first impressions. He smiled and said he was excited to learn from the best people on the team. I found out about the promotion on a Tuesday afternoon in May. I'd been in back-to-back calls all morning. Bob sent a meeting request for 2 o'clock with no subject line. I figured it was about the quarterly review. I brought my notebook. He was already in the conference room when I got there. He didn't stand up. He had his hands folded on the table, which I remember thinking was a strange posture for a conversation he'd initiated. He said he had some news about the senior account director role. He said the decision had been made. He said Connor was going to be stepping into the position. He said it the way you'd read a weather report. I didn't move for a moment. I just let the sentence sit in the air between us. Then I said, "Can I ask why?" Bob said the board felt that Connor brought a different kind of energy, said the company was looking to evolve its approach, and Connor's educational background aligned well with that direction. Said he hoped I'd be supportive of the transition and that my continued role would be crucial. I said, "Crucial." He nodded. I said, "I want to make sure I understand. I've been here 8 years. I built the Western Territory. I put together a full business plan for this role that you asked me to prepare, and the position went to someone who's been here 11 weeks with no industry experience because of his educational background." Bob's jaw tightened a little. He said the decision was final. I said I needed a day to think about it. That night I sat in my car in the parking garage for about 20 minutes before I drove home. Not crying, just sitting. I'd given a significant chunk of my adult life to that company. I'd turned down 2 other job offers in year 5 because Bob had talked about my future there in terms that felt like promises. I'd relocated after the first year, uprooted my whole life, because the company asked me to, and I believed in where we were going. My daughter was 11 when I took that job. She was 19 now and in her 2nd year at the University of Colorado. I'd missed a lot of her growing up years for quarterly reviews and client visits and team offsites. I told myself it was building towards something. I drove home, I made dinner. I called my brother in Phoenix and talked for 2 hours. My brother has a way of cutting through things. He said, "What do you actually want?" I said, "I wanted to be somewhere that valued what I brought." He said, "Then you already know what to do." I went into work the next morning and I wrote my resignation letter. It was short. I thanked the company for 8 years of opportunity. I gave 4 weeks notice instead of 2 because I wanted to do the transition right and because, and I want to be honest about this, I still had a lot of relationships at that company that I cared about. The clients, the junior reps I'd mentored, the operations team. This wasn't about torching everything. It was about being done. I sent the letter to Bob in HR at 9 a.m. Bob called me at 9,007. He didn't start with hello. He said, "Is this a joke?" He actually said that. Not a figure of speech, not rhetorical. He genuinely seemed to believe I might be testing him somehow. I said it wasn't a joke. He said I couldn't leave right now. The end of quarter was in 3 weeks and we had 3 major contract renewals pending. I said I understood and I'd do everything I could to make the transition smooth during my 4 weeks. He said the transition would be Connor. I said, "Good. Then Connor has 4 weeks to learn the accounts." There was a silence on the phone that I think surprised both of us. Then Bob said, in a voice that had gone very quiet, that if I left under these circumstances, he couldn't guarantee a reference. I said I'd spent 8 years building a reputation in this industry, and references from him specifically weren't something I was counting on. I said it politely, factually. Then I said I had a call in 10 minutes and would he like to set up a time to discuss transition planning. He hung up. What happened over the next 4 weeks, I could not have predicted. The first thing that happened was that my 3 largest clients found out I was leaving. I didn't tell them. I think it came through the grapevine. Maybe from someone on the ops team. Maybe Connor mentioned it without realizing what he was doing. But within the first week, I had calls from Randall at Pacific Rim Logistics, Sandra at Westfield Industrial, and a guy named Pete who ran a mid-size manufacturing outfit in Tacoma that I'd personally brought to Callaway 4 years ago. All 3 of them wanted to know if it was true. All 3 of them asked where I was going. I told them I was exploring options. I wasn't going to poach clients. That's not who I am, and it's not how I operate. But I also wasn't going to lie to people I'd worked with for years and pretend everything was fine. What I didn't know was that Randall had already called the company directly and said that if I wasn't their point of contact, he was going to take his contract to our primary competitor at renewal. Randall's account was worth about $2.3 million annually. Sandra's was slightly smaller, about $1.8. Pete's was smaller still, but he'd grown 40% in the last 2 years, and we both knew the long-term value. I found out later that Bob walked into a board meeting in week 2 with 3 clients threatening to pull contracts worth a combined $4 million plus, all because of a personnel decision he'd made without consulting the board. I was not in that meeting, but I heard about it from Donna, who'd stayed on in an advisory capacity, and who called me one evening to say, in a tone that was more tired than dramatic, "You wouldn't believe the week we're having." I told her I appreciated her calling. She said, "You did everything right for what it's worth." I said, "I know." Meanwhile, I was still coming into the office every day, finishing my handoff documentation, briefing Connor on every account. Connor, to his credit, showed up. He listened. He took notes. He was clearly intelligent. I never doubted that. And he knew he was in over his head, which is a kind of self-awareness that at least gave him a fighting chance. One afternoon toward the end of my 3rd week, we were going over the Westfield account together, and he stopped and looked at the folder of documentation I'd put together, and he said, "How long did this take you?" I said, 8 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My uncle told me this would be a good opportunity. He made it sound like you'd want to move into something else anyway." I said I didn't. He nodded slowly. He said, "I'm sorry. I want you to know I didn't ask for this." I believed him. That's the thing I didn't expect. I actually believed him. He wasn't the villain of this story. He was 27 years old, and his uncle had handed him something he hadn't fully asked for, something he was smart enough to know he wasn't ready for. And now he was sitting across from me trying to absorb 8 years of institutional knowledge in 4 weeks. I didn't envy him. I wasn't angry at him the way I probably would have been a few days earlier. The person I was angry at was sitting in the corner office pretending this was all a minor operational hiccup. My last day was a Friday. I'd accepted a position at a competitor, a good one, with a title that reflected what I'd actually earned, and a salary that made my 8 years at Callaway look like a bad financial decision in hindsight. I wasn't going to poach clients, but I wasn't going to pretend the opportunity wasn't there. And I wasn't going to say no to a company that looked at my resume and immediately saw what Bob had apparently stopped seeing years ago. On my last morning, I cleaned out my desk. I had 8 years of stuff in those drawers, not much of it personal, honestly. A coffee mug. A photo of my daughter at her high school graduation. The notebook. I thought about leaving the notebook. I'd spent years building that thing. 340 pages of client history, preferences, notes, context that existed nowhere in the company's official systems because nobody had ever built systems good enough to hold it. For a moment I thought, I should leave this. It belongs to these accounts, these clients. Then I thought about the conversation in that conference room. The weather report voice, the decision is final. I took the notebook. I wasn't going to use it improperly. But it was mine. I'd built it. It contained the knowledge I'd spent 8 years accumulating. And that knowledge came with me. Bob wasn't there when I left. He sent an email thanking me for my service and wishing me well in my next chapter. 14 years of combined relationship, 8 as colleagues, the 6 before that when we'd crossed paths at industry events, and that's what I got. 1 paragraph. Auto signature at the bottom. I walked out of the building at 11:30 on a Friday morning. Shook hands with a few colleagues, hugged two of the junior reps I'd mentored, and went to lunch by myself at a place around the corner where the manager knew my order. I ordered a burger. I sat by the window. I felt, and I know this sounds strange, fine. Not happy exactly. Not yet. But not broken either. Cleaner than I'd felt in years, actually. Like I'd been carrying something that had been getting heavier so gradually I'd stopped noticing the weight, and now it was gone. 3 weeks into my new job, Randall called my cell. He said he'd decided not to renew with Callaway. He said he was going with our competitor, the company I now worked for, and he wanted to work with me specifically if that was possible. I told him I'd need to run it through proper channels, and he said he expected nothing less. Randall is now one of my accounts at the new company. I didn't call him, I didn't reach out, he found me. I heard through the industry grapevine that Connor left Callaway about 4 months after I did. Donna told me he'd gone back to his uncle and said, very simply, that the job wasn't a good fit, and he wanted to find something where he could actually build something on his own merits. She said Bob had been furious, then quiet, then furious again. The board put him on a performance improvement plan in Q3. I don't take any particular pleasure in that. I want to be honest about that too. There's a thing people expect you to feel in stories like this: vindication, satisfaction, a clean emotional resolution. And there's some of that. But mostly, what I feel is just clarity. I know who I am in a professional context. I know what I'm worth and how to demonstrate it. I know the difference between a company that values you and a company that uses you. The difference is smaller than you'd think and harder to see when you're inside it. What I didn't realize until I was on the outside was how much energy I'd spent in those last couple of years managing my own frustration, smoothing things over, telling myself the patience would pay off. I was good at my job, but I was also expending a significant amount of effort maintaining my belief that the system was fair. That's work. That's real labor that doesn't show up in any quarterly report. My daughter came home for spring break about a month after I started the new job. We went for a hike outside of Boulder, one of our old spots from when she was a kid. On the way back down the trail, she said, "You seem different." I asked her what she meant. She said, "Lighter, like you're not annoyed about something you're not talking about." She's always been perceptive. I thought about how to answer that. I said I spent a long time at a job where I was treated like a tool that was very useful but also very replaceable, and I finally left. She said, "What took you so long?" That question followed me home. I've been sitting with it. The honest answer is that I had invested too much to walk away easily, and there's a specific kind of sunk cost thinking that makes smart people stay in bad situations longer than they should. I kept believing that the investment would eventually be honored, that loyalty would register, that the years and the effort and the results would, at some point, produce what I'd been led to expect. The mistake wasn't working hard. The mistake was outsourcing my own evaluation of my worth to someone who had a conflict of interest in seeing it clearly. Bob never apologized. I didn't expect him to. Some people have a remarkable capacity for reframing their own decisions. Bob convinced himself, I'm sure, that I was the one who'd let the team down by leaving at a critical time, that he'd made a reasonable choice and been punished unfairly for it. That's how those stories get rewritten. That's how the person who built the thing ends up cast as the person who broke it. I'm not angry about that anymore. I was for a while. I'm not now. I'm writing this because I know there's someone reading who has spent years somewhere, building something, doing things right, and they're sitting across from a version of that conference room and wondering whether the investment will ever pay off. Maybe they're waiting for the promotion. Maybe they're waiting for the acknowledgement. Maybe they're waiting for the system to work the way they were told it worked when they started. I can't tell you whether to stay or go. I can only tell you what I learned. The company isn't keeping track of your years the way you are. The institution doesn't feel the weight of what you've given the way you feel it. The relationship that feels reciprocal from where you're sitting may look very different from the other side of that desk. Know your worth, not in the abstract, not as a self-help phrase. Concretely, know what you've built. Know what would collapse without you and what wouldn't. Know what your skills are worth in the market because that number is real information and you should have it. And if you've been carrying a notebook for 8 years, literal or figurative, know that it leaves with you. That knowledge is yours. You built it. It goes where you go. I've thought a lot about what I would tell someone who's sitting where I was sitting 3 years ago. Not in that conference room. I mean in the years before it, when I was still doing the work, still believing the math would eventually add up, still telling myself that 8 years of results would count for something when the moment finally came. Here's what I know now. The math does add up. It just doesn't always add up in the place you did the work. What happened to me wasn't random. Bob didn't accidentally overlook me. He made a deliberate choice based on a value system I hadn't fully recognized. One where loyalty to family outweighed loyalty to merit, where a name on a family tree carried more weight than a name on every major account in the Western region. I couldn't change that value system. I couldn't earn my way around it, no matter how many quarterly reports I stayed late to finish, no matter how many clients I flew out to see on my own dime. And the moment I understood that clearly, not as a wound, but as a fact, everything else became simple. That clarity's the thing I want to talk about. Not revenge. Not satisfaction, though I won't pretend there wasn't some of that when Randall called. I want to talk about what it costs to stay somewhere that can't see you accurately, and how much energy you spend without realizing it. Not on the work, but on managing your own belief that the work will eventually be enough. That's the hidden tax. That's what I was paying every single year I stayed past the point where I should have seen the writing on the wall. Connor understood something that his uncle never did. He sat across from me in that office in my 3rd week, looked at 8 years of documentation I built, and said he was sorry. He was 27 years old, and he had more integrity in that moment than his uncle had shown me in a decade. Connor left 4 months after I did because he knew from the inside that he hadn't earned what he'd been handed, that kind of self-awareness. The willingness to walk away from something undeserved. That's not weakness. That's intelligence of a very specific kind. The kind that's harder to teach than anything I put in that notebook. What I've learned is that integrity compounds. Not quickly and not always visibly, but it compounds. The reputation I built over 8 years. The clients who trusted me, the junior reps who remembered what I showed them, the industry contacts who knew my name. None of that disappeared when I walked out of that building. It moved with me. Randall didn't call because I'd been wronged. He called because over 4 years of working together, I'd never once let him down. And he knew the difference between a company and a person. That's the thing worth building. Not the title, not the tenure. The record of how you treated people when you had every reason to cut corners and didn't. The last thing I want to say is this. My daughter asked me what took so long. I didn't have a clean answer for her then. I think the answer is that I confused investment with identity. I put so much of myself into that place that leaving felt like admitting the years were wasted. They weren't. The years built me. The company just didn't deserve to keep what those years had made. Know the difference. That distinction, once you see it clearly, changes everything.